These men are engaged in a war of liberation against a Soviet-backed Marxist regime. They are the Mozambique National Resistance, or Renamo. Some observers believe that Renamo may be on the verge of becoming the first guerrilla movement to succeed in overthrowing a communist government.
Renamo is very close to win.
Despite a U.S. policy of aiding other anti-communist guerrillas around the world as part of the Reagan Doctrine, Renamo has received no American support.
The Mozambican government is closely allied with the Soviet Union, but not as closely as I think many people assume.
The United States should recognize Renamo as the legitimate representative of the Mozambican people and begin to aid the Renamo resistance.
Why has Renamo not received American aid? And should the United States now help them in their fight against Mozambique's Marxist government? In our Washington studios, we'll ask Jack Wheeler, director of the Freedom Research Foundation, who has traveled inside Mozambique with the Renamo rebels, and Herbert Howe, the head of the African Studies program at Georgetown University, who opposes U.S. aid to Renamo, the Mozambique National Resistance, and the Reagan Doctrine. From Washington, this is American Interests. American Interests is made possible by grants from IBM, Exxon, Avis Incorporated, and Pfizer, Inc. Additional funding is provided by the Starr Foundation and the John M. Owen Foundation.
Welcome to American Interests. I'm Peter Crow. For nearly a decade, the African country of Mozambique has been racked by civil war between a national government allied with Moscow and rebels who claim to be pro-Western freedom fighters. Washington has been trying, through economic aid, to steer the Mozambican government away from Moscow, but the rebels have been gaining in strength and are now calling for American assistance. The success of the rebels on the battlefield has led many to view the war as a test case for the Reagan Doctrine, that set of convictions which guide U.S. policy in Nicaragua, Angola, and other countries where anti-communist guerrillas have received a helping hand from Washington. In Mozambique, where just weeks ago President Machel died in an airplane crash, the call for U.S. aid is growing louder as the turmoil in the countryside increases.
For more than 10 years, he was the charismatic leader of his nation and one of the few black African leaders who would negotiate with the South African government. He was Samora Machel, the president of Mozambique. On October 19th, Machel was killed when his presidential jet crashed in uncertain circumstances 1 mile inside South Africa. In Maputo, Mozambique's capital, state funerals were held for other top officials who died with Machel in the crash. Nearly twice the size of California, Mozambique is located on the southeastern coast of Africa. Mozambique's location makes it a major factor in the regional balance of power between white-ruled South Africa and the black frontline states which opposed the Pretoria regime. After independence in 1975, Machel, as the leader of the Front for the Liberation of Mozambique, or Frelimo, became the president of Mozambique. Under his leadership, Frelimo began to transform the country into a Marxist-Leninist state through forced collectivization of farms and nationalization of industrial firms. In 1977, President Machel signed a 20-year treaty of friendship and cooperation with the Soviet Union.
The Mozambican government is closely allied with the Soviet Union, but not as closely as I think many people assume.
The Soviet Union has provided a significant amount of arms. They have provided some economic aid, but not nearly as much as Mozambique would hope for.
Mozambicans opposed to the communist system being established by the Frelimo regime launched a guerrilla war in the late 1970s. These anti-communist guerrillas belong to the Mozambique National Resistance, or Renamo.
Renamo was started by the White Rhodesians when the Liberation War was still going on in Rhodesia as a counterinsurgency force to operate in Mozambique, where the Rhodesian guerrillas had sanctuary. After the independence of Zimbabwe, the South African Defense Force took over and trained and supplied Renamo. And the belief is that it still is the principal sponsor of Renamo.
Despite these questionable beginnings, supporters of Renamo argue that they are no longer relevant.
Renamo has definitely evolved in a true indigenous liberation movement. They blacks, native indigenous blacks, Mozambicans comprise overwhelmingly its leadership, more overwhelmingly than the Frelimo regime against which they fight.
The Mozambique national resistance has been defined in some circles as a handful South African-led bandits. But as you can see, all these people became dissatisfied. They are not just handful bandits. After all, Renamo is now fighting in all 10 provinces. Now, if you are going to call population in 10 provinces handful, then I do not know the meaning of handful.
It is generally acknowledged that Renamo now controls at least 2/3 of Mozambique and has the capability to strike at targets anywhere within the country. Renamo has succeeded in disrupting the strategically vital Beira rail and pipeline corridor, which links the landlocked black African states of Zimbabwe and Zambia to the port city of Beira.
The Beira corridor is crucial because it has a rail line, a road, and an oil pipeline all running in parallel. And to the extent that the hinterland countries, Zambia, Zimbabwe, even to an extent Botswana and Zaire, can use that Beira corridor, they do not have to rely upon South African transport links.
In the aftermath of Michel's death, Renamo may now attempt a major military offensive to overthrow the Marxist Frelimo regime.
I think that Renamo would like to take advantage of the death of Michel. I think in some circles there's an expectation that Frelimo will be in a total state of disarray, and if one were to want to topple the government, now would be the time to do it.
If only Renamo received anti-tank weapons and anti-air weapons, they would be able to take Maputo, the capital, this year.
Joining us to discuss the Reagan Doctrine and the future of Mozambique are Jack Wheeler, director of the Freedom Research Foundation, a group with extensive contacts with anti-communist guerrilla forces around the world, and Herbert Howe, professor of African politics at Georgetown University. Mr. Wheeler, why should we care about Mozambique, this destitute, distant, Soviet-allied country?
Well, Mozambique is part of the Soviet colonial empire. There is a worldwide rebellion going on throughout that empire, from Nicaragua to Angola to Afghanistan. The Renamo liberation movement is about to become the first democratic liberation movement to overthrow a Soviet client state. That is a momentous moment. And once that happens, people will see that the Soviets can be defeated. It could precipitate a rollback of the Soviet colonial empire. It's also the entire political situation in all of southern Africa is at stake, and that is a very, very important region for the United States.
Mr. Howe, is this why we should be interested in Mozambique?
Well, I really disagree almost 100% with Jack. I think that if we start helping Renamo, we're going to bring in the Soviets and their influence much more than previously. Our influence, both in Mozambique and the region, will go down. That there might be substantial military and economic costs if we get too aligned with Renamo. Basically, I see it as basically all costs and no benefit to the United States, and that in American interest, we should stay away.
You see it in American interest to evict the Frelimo regime and replace it with the Renamo guerrillas?
Well, it may be that we don't have any choice in the matter. Renamo is going to win. The Frelimo government is far and away the weakest colonial regime in the Soviet Empire. The Frelimo army is the worst army in Africa, and that is a real achievement. And they are going down. They were going down before the death of Michel. Now, with the death of Michel, it is just about finished for the Frelimo regime. The Soviets have not got the money to back up their empire. I think that it is, of course, in our interests to back Renamo, but we may not have much say in the matter at all. Renamo is going to win, and may win within a matter of weeks.
Mr. Howe, do you agree with this assessment of the fragility of the Frelimo regime?
Well, I think the Frelimo regime certainly is fragile. It's gone through 22 straight years of war. However, I feel that Renamo is not a political organization and that Frelimo still has substantial political backing. And I certainly do not view the Frelimo government of Mozambique as being in the Soviet colonial empire. It's a nationalistic state that has its own interests far above that of some white country 3, 4, 8,000 miles away from it.
What is the pedigree, Mr. Howe, of the Renamo forces? You know, are they our kind of guys?
Well, as the clip showed, Renamo was set up in 1975 by the white Rhodesian government of Ian Smith, and when the Rhodesian government lost to Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe government in 1980, South African military intelligence just airlifted Renamo down into the northern Transvaal of South Africa. I will concede certainly that Renamo is almost entirely black Mozambican, a lot of whom are disaffected with the Frelimo government. But again, that's in part simply because of forces outside of Frelimo's handling. Drought, for example, $600 million lost because of the Rhodesian War, continued incursions by the South African government, plus what I still view as South Africa's surrogate, which is Renamo.
How would you characterize the Renamo forces? What are they composed of? Are they democratic pro-Western forces?
They're definitely democratic pro-Western and pro-free market. They were started by Frelimo soldiers that saw what Samora Machel was doing to their country. They used Rhodesia as a sanctuary, but to call them South Africa-backed or Rhodesian-backed is to miss the point entirely.
Who's backing them?
Nobody is backing them. They are a genuine homegrown insurgency. That's the extraordinary
But where are they
thing.
getting their supplies and their equipment?
Most of them are almost all captured. They have no sanctuary. They're a pariah. The State Department hates them. The Foreign Ministry of South Africa hates them. They won't cooperate with them. They are a homegrown insurgency, and yet they are the closest of all to victory.
Mr. Howe, do you agree that the South Africans don't have a hand in this Renamo operation?
Well, I mean, I totally disagree. South Africans did not admit its identity with Renamo starting with 1980, and then when facts became abundantly clear, it said yes. We're associated with Renamo. And then in March 16th of 1984, South Africa signed an agreement with Mozambique saying we won't allow Renamo to cross the border if you don't allow ANC to cross into South Africa. A year later, however, documents which South Africa does not deny the validity of were captured at the main Renamo base inside Mozambique and documented very, very clearly the South African continuing connection with Renamo.
Doesn't this make sense, Mr. Wheeler, that the country in the world, let alone in the region, with the greatest stake in the outcome of politics in Mozambique is South Africa?
Well, the situation is that the South African government has a little war going on within itself. The Foreign Ministry does not want to help Renamo. They have seen to it that help has been cut off. They saw to it the Nkomati Accords were signed. They set up a lot of those documents that were found at Gorongosa, which has since been recaptured by the Renamo forces. The South African military intelligence, on the other hand, does want to help Renamo.
And is helping Renamo?
They are prevented for the most part. If there is any help, and it's very unclear if there is or not right now or since Nkomati, since 1984, it has been very, very minimal. Everybody expected Renamo to just roll up into a ball after Nkomati was signed, and yet they came on stronger than ever. The fact has to be faced that Renamo is a popular and homegrown insurgency within Mozambique. They deny about 80% of the country to Renamo, to Frelimo. Jane's Defense Weekly just reported, a very authoritative source, supported there is very, very widespread popularity and support for Renamo throughout the country. This is a popular insurgency, and saying it's backed by South Africa or something, I mean, the Afghans are backed by the Pakistanis in many ways. That doesn't mean that the Afghan Mujahideen aren't very, very popular in their country.
But South Africa is the superpower in the region. Doesn't it really control the destiny there of the frontline states in their internal politics? It can play the spoiler, certainly, can it not?
It's certainly playing the spoiler, and when we talk about Renamo, we can't simply talk about Mozambique. But Mozambique controls, as the film clip showed, the main transportation links to the sea of a number of frontline states if they want to avoid South Africa. And if South Africa, through Renamo, destabilizes Mozambique and knocks out the three major railway links those countries, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Botswana, Malawi, have really no other recourse but to have to go down through South Africa, which makes not only an economic dependency, I would argue, but also a political dependency upon South Africa.
Well, gentlemen, let's take a look at the regional implications of the war in Mozambique and the costs and possible benefits of U.S. involvement.
There's been a lot of speculation that Mozambique might follow the course of Angola and invite in Cuban troops. And of course, in American eyes and in South African eyes, this would cast the entire Mozambican situation in a very different light.
In Afghanistan, Nicaragua, Angola, and Kampuchea, the United States is aiding anti-communist insurgencies as part of what has been called the Reagan Doctrine. But the anti-communist forces of Renamo in Mozambique are receiving no American support. Renamo acknowledges that it has received aid from South Africa, but maintains that after the Frelimo government signed the Nkomati Accord with South Africa in 1984, that aid was cut off.
My understanding is that after Nkomati Accord, the agreement that was signed between Mozambique and South Africa, Renamo is not receiving military aid from South Africa.
I have inspected Renamo's weapons when I was with Renamo in the field. If Renamo is receiving any aid from South Africa, it is very small indeed.
Many observers, however, claim that the South Africans are now violating the Nkomati Accord by continuing to supply the Renamo guerrillas with weapons and ammunition.
Looking back, it looks like the Nkomati Accord was a Trojan horse for Mozambique. It was considered the high water mark, really, of constructive engagement in this country because we were the midwife of this non-aggression pact between Mozambique and South Africa, in which each country had agreed not to continue to supply rebels operating in each other's country. Apparently, the South Africans did not uphold their end of the deal, and as a result, the insurgency in Mozambique has expanded considerably.
Renamo is led by the enigmatic Afonso Lacama. Although successful on the battlefield, Renamo until recently has failed to spell out its ultimate political goals.
The goals of Renamo is to establish an open society. By open society, I mean politically to have a true democracy. By true democracy, I mean to respect different opinions. And those different opinions that can be articulated in different political parties. Economically, true democracy means individuals to be allowed to be engaged in a free enterprise. Mozambicans should have a right to have their private property.
Despite U.S. support for other anti-communist insurgencies around the world, the U.S. State Department has consistently backed Mozambique's Marxist government.
The State Department has tried for years under the Reagan administration to try and woo Mozambique away from the Soviet bloc, and backed some assistance, even including at some point a very small amount of military assistance. But at different periods of time, this aid has been cut off, mainly by right-wing forces who feel that we should not be supporting a Marxist government.
This past year, legislation was introduced in Congress which would provide $5 million in aid to Renamo and cut off all American aid to the Frelimo government.
The United States should recognize Renamo as the legitimate representative of the Mozambican people and begin to aid the Renamo resistance and help it prepare to take charge of its government in a constructive way when they take over.
Others caution against taking such a step.
If the most dangerous scenario were played out, and that is everyone started to intervene in Mozambique, that would put at risk our new position in South Africa, because if we were seen to be on the side of South Africa or backing Renamo, which is considered to be also on the side of South Africa, then the credibility of our position in opposing apartheid is at risk.
Mr. Wheeler, Renamo is on the move. The president of Mozambique has recently been killed in an airplane crash. A new president has been elected or appointed, Chissano, who is purportedly a pragmatic. What should the United States do now?
Well, the situation with Renamo is the great contradiction in the Reagan doctrine. We're backing UNITA in Angola, the Contras in Nicaragua, the Afghan Mujahideen, and yet the one resistance movement within the Soviet Empire that is closest of all to victory, it is the pariah. That's because the State Department thinks it can wean away some commie dictatorship into our camp, which is just what we need, a bunch of
reformed commies.
This regime is has one of the worst human rights records in all of Africa, and again, that is an incredible distinction. It is a very, very evil, ruthless, murderous regime.
So what should we do? Should we pump aid to the Renamo forces? Military aid?
I think that at the very least, we should insist that there be some negotiations between the Frelimo government and Renamo, and at the very least insist on genuine elections. That's what Renamo is fighting for.
And if there is not? If Chissano
wants to be ruler of Mozambique, it's fine with Lacama as long as he is elected. That's what they're fighting for. They're not fighting for power, they're fighting for elections. And that's what we should insist on. If democracy is good for the blacks of South Africa, and of course it is, then it is equally good for the blacks of Mozambique.
Mr. Howe, should we continue with our present policy, which seems to be an attempt to wean this Marxist regime away from Soviet support?
Well, I think so far the American, especially the Western Europeans, have been able to encourage Mozambique's shift into a true non-alignment. Since 1983, I believe, Mozambique has joined the IMF, it's joined the World Bank, it's joined the Lome Accords. It's become integrated very much into the Western economic system. Now, the West can, I think, step up its economic assistance, especially on the Beira corridor. And there's also the option of military equipment. Britain, a close Western European ally of ours.
But military equipment to the Frelimo regime?
That's certainly one possibility. It could certainly be non-lethal defensive equipment.
Where has there been a history of success in weaning a Soviet-backed regime away from their source of support?
Well, first of all, the Soviets are not the only source of support for Mozambique, and never really have. Very little economic assistance from the Soviets goes into Mozambique. As Jack said, the Soviets simply don't have the ability to provide economic assistance, and if we're able to provide it, so much better for the United States.
But if we have some fellows that are out there in the field that kind of look like our kind of guys, and they're for elections, and they're for the free enterprise system, and they look like they're going to win, why not help them?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure that they're going to win. Secondly, I still maintain that Renamo is not a political organization. It does not have a charismatic leader. Its first political manifesto came out 6 years after the organization was formed. It has not liberated villages. It does not have political cells within the country. It's basically a military unit, a very successful military unit, I might add, that's terrorizing the rural population of Mozambique.
Well, are you worried if we help Renamo that the Soviet Union may throw more into the country than they now are, and that they might consider it a test of will between us and them in Mozambique?
That's certainly a possibility, and I think if the Soviet Union gets more and more involved in Mozambique, that raises the ante to the United States. And what should the United States do then? Fish or cut bait? There's a possibility that the Soviet Union comes in on the side of Mozambique, or else Cuba or GDR or whatever, but that could embroil the whole region into war.
Does this prospect worry you, Mr. Wheeler?
No, not at all.
The Soviets have a greater interest in Mozambique than we do, and they'll throw more in there than we will.
No, not at all, because Mozambique can't pay for it. The reason that Angola has 35,000 Cuban troops is because they've got oil, and they can pay for it. Castro is a communist mercenary. Mozambique does not have the money to pay for Cuban troops. That's why there are no Cuban troops there. The Zimbabweans, who are all going back to Zimbabwe in body bags. Herbert says that Mozambique with Frelimo is becoming integrated into the Western economic system, but not the Western political system. It is still a Marxist dictatorship. There are no human rights in Mozambique. This is a terrible, horrible, murderous regime, and that's what at least we should be concerned with. Of course, Renamo isn't a political organization. It's a military organization that is fighting for elections, not for power.
Is it possible that Renamo would win without us? And
yes,
well, then
why don't
we just let it be, and then we can have our cake and eat it too?
Well, I think that they should at least be assisted, and at the very least we should insist that there be negotiations between Lacama and Chissano. He's much more open to a deal now.
Who is much more open?
Chissano. Chissano actually tried to make a deal with the CIA in '78 to overthrow Michel, and that didn't work, and the word leaked out, and so he told Michel that, oh, it's a CIA plot to ruin my name.
You think there may be better prospects for reconciliation?
There are better prospects for reconciliation with Chissano.
Do you see this as being the case, Mr. Howe?
Well, I think Chissano right now is very, very pragmatic, but I don't think Mozambique at the present time is going to sit down at the table with Renamo.
They may not have any choice.
Yeah, and if it's an interesting question. Frelimo might be very much anti-human rights, as you're saying, but if it's not a threat to American interests, why should America attempt to destabilize that regime?
Because it destabilizes a portion of the Soviet colonial empire. And it is what I call the myth of hopelessness, the belief that the Soviets cannot be beaten, that the Brezhnev doctrine is inviolate, that gives the Soviets their impression of power. Once the Soviets are thrown out of one of their client states, you're going to see an unraveling of the Brezhnev doctrine.
We just have a few seconds left. Suppose the United States doesn't change its policy. What will happen in
Renamo will win anyway, whether the State Department likes it or not.
Mr. Howe, what is your prediction?
I think there's basically going to be a military stalemate for some time. It basically depends upon Soviet reaction and certainly upon South African involvement within the region.
Thank you very much, Mr. Howe. Thank you, Mr. Wheeler. Until next week, for American Interests, I'm Peter Crow.
American Interests is made possible by grants from IBM, Exxon, Avis Incorporated, and Pfizer Inc. Additional funding is provided by the Starr Foundation and the John M. Owen Foundation. Video cassette copies of American Interests can be obtained from the Blackwell Corporation, 1255 23rd Street Northwest, Washington, D.C., 20037. For a transcript of this program, send $3 in a self-addressed stamped envelope to Rapid Transcript, P.O. Box 70808, Washington, D.C., 20024. Please specify program topic. This program was produced by the Blackwell Corporation, which is solely responsible for its content.